I have with me on the Phil Ferguson Show, video and audio, podcast and YouTube, Thom Hartmann. And Mr. Hartmann, if I may, has a syndicated, I guess it's syndicated, a really big radio show that is played all around the country. And who knows, maybe you should be all around the world. And of course, you have a brand new book coming out that I was fortunate enough to get an advance copy and read through that. Unfortunately, because I read it, it's kind of heartbreaking, all the things that you document. Please tell us what is the title of that book and what is the date that it goes public? Oh, he's got a paper version.
I'm not sure the date. I think it's September 18th or 19th, something like
Okay,
that. And the book is The Last American President. The subtitle is A Broken Man, a Corrupt Party, and a World on the Brink.
so I'm guessing it talks. I'm not guessing because I read it. It talks about Trump,
Yep.
and you go through a lot of the background, uh, what made Trump, how he's such a smart businessman. Do you want to go chronologically? Do you want to go book order? Is there something burning in your chest that you got to talk about first with relationship to Trump, or anything else that you're working on? I'll
Oh,
just an open question.
I'm good to let you run the interview.
Oh, well, thank you. So you talked a lot about Trump's childhood. Give us a few talking points on that.
Well, the subtitle is A Broken Man, and I think it's really true. Which is, by the way, so true of so many people who have ended up essentially like dictators. I mean, Hitler
Yeah.
was from a broken family, abusive father, all that kind of stuff. Trump's father was a psychopath, at the very least, a sociopath. Clearly, mentally a very sick man. And this isn't speculation. I mean, you can get it from his niece, Mary Trump, who is a clinical psychologist and has written a book about it.
Right.
And Trump's mother, Mary Trump, was a Scottish immigrant. The Trump men seem to have a thing about bringing European women over.
Yeah.
And she so disliked, apparently, her children, or at least Donald, that every summer when he was home from school, she would go to all by herself to Scotland, which is where she was from, and just leave him alone. So, when he was young, he acted out terribly and so badly that his father stuck him in a private sort of a military school. It wasn't, there's the real military schools are affiliated with
Right.
the military. This one was not. It was a pretend military school, but they wore uniforms and they marched in formation and stuff like that. And he was a pretty notorious bully there and in other places, which is not uncommon for people who are just deeply insecure and feel unloved. And I think that's who he is. I think he's just been desperately, his whole entire life, just desperately looking for the approval of his father and the love of his mother, and never getting either one. And there will never be enough for him. It's like this giant empty black hole and that's why he loves doing his rallies, for example, because he views that applause as the love that he's always wanted to have but never had.
I know recently a lot of really rich people and politicians and global leaders have shown up in the White House, and they all know to bring tribute,
Yeah.
whether it's a plane or a chunk of gold or a watch. I saw one where he got a sheriff's badge, and the look on his face when they announced they're giving him this thing is just like this, I don't know, like 8-year-old boy.
At Christmas, yeah.
Yeah, because they announced that he's getting this honorary sheriff's badge, and you could almost hear inside of his head, "Well, is that a real sheriff's badge? Because I'm going to be a sheriff." Pew pew. And it's just absolutely profound that it's that easy if you play a certain game to get his ear and to get his favors. And of course, as he grew up, he got hundreds of millions from his father to run businesses, to
Yeah.
start businesses. And of course, a big section of the book is about his ability to build a business empire. Uh, is that how it works? Is he just master of making money, or is he the bankruptcy queen that always loses in the end?
Well, he blew his father's fortune. His father gave him about $400 million, and over $1 billion in today's money. and some of which, according to his niece, he basically stole from his siblings and other relatives, and and basically blew it. I mean, he had a whole series of failed companies, um, from an airline to water company to a board game company to, on and on and on, a fake university.
Yep.
Many of them were just hustles or frauds, but he was always attracted to that. He always wanted to be a successful businessman, but he couldn't even run a casino. I mean, he bankrupted a couple of casinos even. Um, and it appears that what he was doing was he was, living off this money, living high on the hog, and funding everything with debt, just massive debt. And apparently, what appears to be, and according to people who've documented this, people like Craig Unger or David K. Johnston, doing a lot of money laundering for Russian oligarchs via real estate. In fact, that appears to be what broke him up with Jeffrey Epstein. There was a property in Florida that Trump was going to buy cheap and then sell to a Russian oligarch very expensive and make a pile of money on. And Epstein wanted to do apparently the same thing. And Trump got the property and sold it to the oligarch and, walked away with a huge multi-million dollar profit. And Epstein was pissed about it. But I would not call him a successful businessman. I'd call him a nepo baby, a trust fund baby who squandered everything and then lived on debt for a long time until he hooked up with the Russians. And both of his sons have publicly said, we don't need American money. We get all the money we need from Russia. And I think, frankly, he's been in Russia's pocket ever since.
Because it's been quite a while. I think I did it during the first campaign of Trump, 8 years ago. I did an analysis of the money he claimed that he had at some point in time, and then the amount of money that he claimed to have at a future point in time, just assuming for a moment that that was truthful. His ability to grow that money he would have made more money if he just put it in the stock market in an index fund
Right.
than all the management. So he's underperforming doing nothing.
Yeah.
And the vast majority of that, like you said, he spends, he gets debt, and then he doesn't pay vendors, he doesn't pay employees,
He's
and
been sued
spends,
over 3,000 times.
yeah, millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars in debt that he lives on, and then files bankruptcy. And I think he himself even once said that he loves bankruptcy. I could see why he would, because he just keeps making money off of it.
Yeah.
And if we can, we'll jump to modern day. Is Donald Trump the president of peace, as we were promised? Like the second coming of Jesus Christ, he's going to bring peace to the world. How's that working out?
I'm very concerned. He appears to be preparing to start a war with Venezuela,
Yes.
trying to provoke one. You'll recall I mean, this is an old song, right? You'll recall when the Marine barracks in Lebanon was blown up in the 1980s and Reagan was president. Reagan basically cut and ran, a couple of hundred dead Marines, but Reagan's response was to pull everybody out of Lebanon and then a couple of weeks later invade Grenada, a little Caribbean island that wasn't bothering anybody.
Right.
And start a little war if you need a distraction, basically. And right now, the Epstein thing is giving him fits. And clearly Pam Bondi and Mike Johnson and everybody in the Trump White House are engaged in a massive cover-up. The question is, what is it that they're covering up? I mean, is there evidence in those files that Trump was, basically raping little girls? Nobody knows, but the way that they're hiding this stuff. So, Trump may welcome a war as a diversion from that, as something, a distraction, something that'll take us away from it. And then, of course, last night, Russia just utterly humiliated Trump. Although I don't think he thinks so.
Right.
In fact, maybe
I don't
on
know
the
that he
meeting.
can think that really.
Well, he had this meeting with Putin a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago in Alaska, which,
Hmm.
first of all, just from the get-go, Putin kind of owned him in that regard because for weeks prior to that, the Russian media had been talking about, the Russian commentators, kind of their version of Rush Limbaugh's, had been out there saying that Alaska, the sale of Alaska to the United States in 1867 by the Russian Tsar at the time, was illegal, and that Alaska was never legally sold to the United States, and Russia still owns it. And there's this huge nationalist thing in Russia about this.
Right.
And so when Putin convinced Trump that they should meet in Alaska, it was exactly what Putin needed, for his local audience. And then, they had these private meetings and nobody knows what was said, but it sure looks like Putin said, I'm going to take Europe and you're going to let me, because that's what's going on. I mean, 10 drones just penetrated Polish airspace last night. Poland has invoked Article 4 of NATO, which is the one step before Article 5, which is we shoot back.
Right.
Uh, and they're having frantic meetings right now in Europe about this and what to do about it, particularly what to do the next time this happens. And you know, and after those meetings in Alaska, where Trump came back and said, "Oh yeah, Putin's going to be nice to Ukraine now." They just doubled and tripled the intensity of their bombing and their murderous campaign and their stealing children and whatnot. And so either Trump signed off on that or Putin's giving him the middle finger. In either case, it's not good for America. It's not good for democracy. It's not good for democracy around the world. It's not good for world peace. And I'm really concerned that he's dancing us toward World War III. And if he starts, a conflict with Venezuela, as he seems hell-bent for leather to do, that could be the thing. Once we get deeply involved in that, that's the point at which Russia says, okay, now we're going to just, blitz Ukraine or drop a tactical nuke on Kyiv or whatever, and then we're going to take Poland and we're going to take apart, the eastern half of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and onward to the Baltics, or to the Baltic Sea. And at that point, we're all tied up, or just Trump says, okay, good luck. And then at that point, China says, okay, time to take Taiwan. And boom. I mean, this is 1943 all over again, and or 41 really. And I am very concerned that we are looking at the same time that we're looking at the possibility of an economic crash looming on the horizon. We're hearing that the economy is not doing as well as we thought, that Trump's tariffs are doing real damage and jacking inflation. The inflation numbers this month were down 1/10 of a point, but they were only down because the economy has softened to the point that people aren't buying things.
Yeah.
And so, companies are having to lower prices and eat tariffs. So, I mean, this is and then there's the 80-year thing. I don't know if are you familiar with the fourth turning with Strauss and Howe?
I'm not. What's that?
Neil Strauss and William Howe wrote this book. They were the first book that they wrote. It was a New York Times bestseller. It was like in 1994, I think. It was called Generations of America. And it was an analysis of all the generations in North America going back to basically the Mayflower. And then they followed that up with a book called The Fourth Turning. And what they found was that basically every 80 years, America has an economic crash followed by a major war, followed by a progressive reboot. And they literally take this back to the 1600s every 80 years. And so you had the great crash of 1771, the Panic of 1771, which led to the American Revolution of 1776. 80 years later, you had the Great Panic of 1856, followed by the American Civil War. 80 years after the end of the Civil War, you had the Republican Great Depression, followed by World War II. And World War II ended exactly 80 years ago this year. So, Strauss and Howe have a theory about why this is. It's kind of got two parts. The first easy part is that 80 years is basically a human lifespan. And so all the people who have learned the lessons of stupid actions are dead, from the last time around. And so this is like, I remember in 1998 or 1999, Texas Republican Senator Phil Gramm got up on the Senate and gave this speech about, canceling Glass-Steagall, repealing Glass-Steagall, which was the bill in the 1930s that separated investment banking from commercial banking and or checkbook banking, and basically kept our banking system safe, for 80 years. And Phil Gramm said, well, it's worked so well, we don't need it anymore. And of course,
Yeah.
that led right to the crash of 2008, right? That deregulation. So you get these stupid ideas that, well, we don't need to worry about this stuff. And so there's that. But then the other thing was what they learned from their generations book was that there are four generations that constantly repeat themselves. You've got the generation who experienced the crash and the war. They produce a generation that are the quiet builders. They put the country back together after the war and the crash, and they just put their shoulders to the grindstone, and they're kind of a silent generation. That generation then produces a generation of people who say, "Well, my parents worked their asses off, and all I got for it was this T-shirt." It's like
Yeah.
I I want to experience enlightenment. I want spiritual renewal. I want to explore my inner. And in the 1800s, that was the generation of Emerson and Thoreau. In this era, it was the generation of the 1960s. Let's drop some acid.
Yeah.
That generation then produces a generation that says, my parents worked their asses off, or excuse me, my parents, contemplated their navel all day long, and didn't never achieved enlightenment. And so, why bother with that? I'm going to get rich. I'm going to make some damn money. And that generation then engages in the excesses and the stupidities of the same generation 80 years earlier that produced the last crash. And that generation then produces this crash. And then, of course, the next generation is the generation that experiences the crash and the war. And, it makes a hell of a lot of sense. And it's the one kind of good outcome of it, if you look at the outcome of the American Revolution, the outcome of the Civil War, or the the time post American Revolution, post Civil War, post World War II, is that in each case you had this progressive renewal. America was not just put back together, but put back together in a way that was much, much better than it was before. And the concern this time around, and Neil Howe just published a new book called The Fourth Turning is Here, in which he suggests that it doesn't always work out that way. And that if you've got a dictator or a fascist in power at the time of the crash and the war, you might end up losing your democracy altogether.
One of the things I see regularly, and I'm happy to share them, are the memes. As an example, a soybean farmer in Oklahoma, assuming they grow soybeans there, but you'll get the idea, that comes on and says, my family's been farming here for 200 years and 7 generations, and because China's not buying what we're producing, we're all going to go broke. This isn't what I voted for. And I get why people want to share that, kind of as the fuck around and find out category. But what I have not seen is a single MAGA person coming out and complaining that other people are getting hurt. It's always this, I'm getting hurt. This is not what I wanted. And Trump needs to change his path, but he's not worried about people being locked up. He's not worried about the families being separated, or kids being put in cages, or people being sent to third world countries, for fuck's sake. We don't even need concentration camps. People around the world have these horrible prisons and we send people to, and they just fucking disappear. When does that stop?
This is a streak that has run through the American conservative movement. And I would argue, that is endemic to conservatism going back to Edmund Burke, and before. Edmund Burke was the British philosopher, actually he was Irish philosopher who, during the American and French Revolution era, who famously said, it does me no harm if a man is allowed to engage in a profession as servile as tallow maker, candle maker, or
Right.
hairdresser, but it does society considerable violence if such a man is allowed to participate in governance, in other words, to vote. And in 1951, Russell Kirk published a book called The Conservative Mind from Burke to Eliot. And T.S. Eliot, it was a notorious conservative in the more modern era. Edmund Burke, of course, the late 1700s. And what Kirk warned about at the time in this book, which is, by the way, if you look up the book, it's like literally considered the Bible of the modern conservative movement. And what he warned about was that the American middle class was growing too large. In the 1930s, when Franklin Roosevelt became president, the American middle class was between 10 and 15% of us. It was a very small percentage. In the census of 1900, what we would call the middle class today was around 8 or 9% of us. The middle class was never that large. And so, what Franklin Roosevelt did by introducing essentially socialism or regulated capitalism,
Right.
but genuine socialism, I mean, Social Security is socialism. And then, of course, the right to unionize and all these other things that, the minimum wage, the unemployment insurance, all these things that led to, he built the middle class. So when Reagan came into office in 1980, two-thirds of us were in the middle class. One-third of us had the equivalent of a union job, and those set the wage floors for the other third of us. So, so anyhow, what Kirk was writing about in 1951, when we were about 25 or 30% of us in the middle class, was that if the middle class ever got too large, and his guess was 50%, that a couple of things would happen. Women would no longer remember their place in society. Young people would no longer respect their elders, and minorities would start demanding equal rights with white people. And all of these three things, Kirk suggested, would be a disaster for our country. They would lead to the collapse of the American experiment. And because you have to have caste, you have to have orders and classes, was the phrase that Kirk used, quoting Edmund Burke. And at the time when the book was published, it had a small but vigorous audience. William F. Buckley and Barry Goldwater were its principal advocates. But most Republicans, most conservatives in America just thought Kirk is a crackpot. He's an alarmist. I mean, keep in mind, this is the 1950s. America's never going to fall apart, and women aren't going to, and blacks aren't going to, quack, quack, quack. But then came the 60s. And in the 1960s, you had, women burning bras. You had the women's liberation movement. The birth control pill was legalized in 61. You had and then you had the young men burning draft cards. You had black people lighting cities on fire when police were abusing them.
Right.
And at that point, the Republicans or the conservatives looked around and said, holy crap, Russell Kirk was right. And that led in the 70s to what became the Reagan Revolution, which was an attempt to roll back the New Deal, to roll back the middle class. And they've been quite successful at it. We've gone from two-thirds of us being in the middle class when Reagan was sworn into office to 45 to 47% of us today. And that has provided the complaint stuff necessary for the Republicans to say, yes, you've been screwed. And it was the Democrats who did it, right? But what's incredible is if you look at Burke and then the more modern version of Burke, which was Ayn Rand and the
Mhm.
whole libertarian movement,
Indeed.
and then take these recent quotes about that Elon Musk said empathy is a poison,
Big
it's a
weakness.
social poison. That basically the conservative movement has always been I, me, you know, I, me, mine. It's never been about, the teachings of Jesus or the teachings of Benjamin Franklin, who was an atheist, but believed in social conscience. The teachings of even the European royals, the idea of noblesse oblige that the Kennedy family adopted, that Joe Kennedy was so fond of and beat into his kids, that you have this obligation of nobility. You must care for the less fortunate because you are so fortunate. All of that stuff was rejected by the conservative movement. And so there's been kind of this self-generative thing where the people who are basically sociopaths who don't have empathy for other people, which is the definition of sociopathy,
Yeah.
these people are attracted to that conservative movement and the Republican Party more generally, but also that people who previously identified as conservatives or as Republicans, maybe just because dad was, start listening to the Rush Limbaughs of the world, to the influencers on the right, and start thinking, maybe they're right. I remember, in the late 80s, early 90s, driving someplace and listening to Rush Limbaugh on the radio, and he was telling this joke. He was like, "What do you do when a man's down? You kick him, otherwise he won't get up." Right? And then but that's the conservative worldview. You kick the guy until he gets up. What Jesus would have said is something very very different. I mean, in fact that was the story of the Samaritan.
Right.
The guy who had been beaten up by robbers. he had been kicked. And so anyway, I think that's I realize you asked me what time it was, and I told you how to build a clock, but I think that that's the essence of the problem that's embedded in conservatism is this idea that empathy and concern for others is a weakness.
Yeah, I summarize it in slightly different words that aren't for your show necessarily, but I call it the "I've got mine, fuck you."
Yeah, exactly.
And
Exactly.
I want to circle back to the book before we run out of your time because I know your time is very valuable. Can you show us the book again for the people that are watching on YouTube? And the title, of course, "The Last American President," and in print, literally days after this video drops, which is, kind of why we're doing it right now. And you're probably doing lots of these, and I thank you for your time. Is there anything about the book that we haven't covered that you want to throw in as closing remarks to get some more people to go buy it?
Well, one of the things that I point out in the book, in addition to policy suggestions and how we got here, and I even write about Russell Kirk in the book. But as I recall, I mean, I don't remember what the editors took out,
Yeah.
so you can tell me if Russell Kirk's still in the book or not. But because I haven't read it since I wrote it. But one of the main things that concerns me is this effort to prevent people from voting.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a big deal.
Greg Palast ran the numbers using official statistics from federal and state agencies. No conspiracy nut stuff at all. Pure 100% official statistics. And what he found was that in the 2024 election, 4.2 million Americans who wanted to vote or cast a vote either were prevented from voting or their vote was not counted. And had those 4.2 million Americans, and we know who they are and where they are,
Yeah.
had those 4.2 million Americans voted, not only would we have Kamala Harris as president right now, but we'd have a Democratic House and Senate. And these efforts at voter suppression, which are all grounded on this notorious lie that goes back to the 1960s, that Mexican immigrants, which was the phrase back in the 60s, are now voting in our elections, which is absolutely not only not true, but has been disproven 16 ways to Sunday, including by Republicans, including by the Trump administration, by the Bush administration, by Senate Republicans in the United States Senate. There is no voter fraud problem in the United States. Voter fraud has never altered the outcome of an election ever. But suppress
Possibly until now, but what we're thinking is voter fraud is the
this is
exact
election
opposite.
fraud, is what
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
talking
yeah.
about,
Yeah,
which is
election fraud. And it's everything from not having enough places to vote in
yeah,
areas that have poorer people or Democratic people or people with melatonin in their skin, to closing drop boxes, to rejecting mail-in ballots, to controlling provisional ballots, to allowing random citizens to protest who's on the voter rolls, even if they're not in that district. The list was quite profound in the book, just one thing after another. And part of the problem is there's not one thing to fix. There's
yeah.
10 things to fix.
Well, it's this larger issue that
Yeah,
the whole thing is based on bullshit. I mean, this idea that there are these illegal voters. There aren't.
yeah, it's
And
very rare.
it's vanishingly rare. And in fact, most of what's ironic is that the majority of quote illegal voters that have been busted in the last couple of years have been Republican voters. But we're still talking about maybe a dozen people, you
Yeah,
know, over the last couple of elections. So it's a meaningless. It's not. I was going to say a meaningless problem. It's not even a problem, but it's a fine excuse to make it very difficult for people to vote. And now you've got the SAVE Act that the Republicans are pushing. It has already passed the House. It's in the Senate, and the SAVE Act says that if your name on your birth certificate is different from the name on your driver's
yes.
license, and you don't have a judge signed court order changing your name, then you can't vote. And my wife, when we got married 53 years ago, took my name, my last name.
Yeah.
We never went to court, never. I mean, under the SAVE Act, she won't be able to vote, and it can cost hundreds of dollars and take months to get your name legally changed. And our courts would be just all tied up by this. Roughly 85% of all women, probably over 90% of all married women in the United States, or adult women, will no longer be able to vote if this law is passed.
And this is
And
some of that clever stuff where they never actually say what they're doing. And Republicans are way better at naming laws, by the way. Just
yeah,
it's bizarro world naming because it's never what it does. But this idea that your name on your license has to match your birth certificate affects a lot of people, married, unmarried, divorced, but predominantly women, which a lot of conservatives don't think they should vote in the first place. And here's a way to make it really hard for a big chunk of the population without them knowing about it in advance, not understanding it in advance. And they just show up and there's a mismatch and they get a provisional ballot if they're lucky. And those probably aren't going to count because you're going to have to go to the courthouse to prove that your provisional ballot should be counted. There's always, and when they make exceptions for the IDs that you need, they might say, oh, well, if you have a gun permit or a hunting license,
yeah.
you can come in. But if you have a student ID with your photo and social security number on it, that doesn't count. If you have a passport because you're a world traveler, that doesn't count. It's all this little stuff, 1,000 little cuts, and I know we're going long. Tell us about the book one more time, and we'll wrap up. And thank you, by the way.
Well, the book is The Last American President, and my goal is to wake people up to what's going on, to how we got here, to how we get out of this, some policy solutions. And by the way, most of America is where you and I are at. I mean, if you look at the policy suggestions that progressives have been pushing for some time, let's strengthen Social Security so that in 1980 you could actually live on Social Security. You can't today.
That'd be kind of tough.
Yeah, so let's fix Social Security. Let's tax the rich. In 1980, the top income tax rate on rich people was 90%. Well, actually, it was 87, 70, 74% in 1980. It had been dropped in the 60s by LBJ, but he closed up a whole bunch of loopholes, so it actually raised taxes on rich people. But it was 74%. Let's go back to that. That was when America was great, right? When you had a strong middle class, we had a 74% income tax bracket. You had a 50% corporate income tax bracket. Now it's 20%. There was a healthy tax on capital gains. There was a healthy tax on inheritances,
Right.
on estates. Let's go back to those things, and then let's say that healthcare is a right, as it is in every other developed country in the world. There's 34 OECD countries. Of all those 34 OECD countries, 500,000 people a year go bankrupt because somebody got sick. Every single one of them is in the United States. Let's make education a right rather than a privilege also. Every single one of those other 33 OECD countries offers essentially free college education or something damn close to it, very, very inexpensive. In many cases, if you're in Germany or if you're in Sweden or Switzerland, they will pay you to go to college. You get a $500 a month stipend to go to college.
They might even pay Americans to go to college sometimes.
They do.
Yeah,
they do.
I know.
There's over 300,000 Americans right now going to college in Germany right now as we speak.
And here we are racking up 40,000 plus per year for 3 or 4 or 5 years, and you go to college and you got a $200,000 debt.
Yeah, and in 1966, 67, 68, when I went to college, I was able to pay for my room and board and my tuition and my books by washing dishes at Bob's Big Boy on Trowbridge Road and pumping gas at the Esso station across the street. And I had a part-time weekend gig as a DJ. And all of those were jobs that paid between $2 and $3 an hour, which, which was sort of like the equivalent of probably minimum wage now, $8, $9 an hour.
Yeah.
So, we can do this again. We did it before. Every other country in the world does it. We just need to get the blood-sucking billionaires off our back.
Yeah, and I know we could talk all day, and you do that for a living. You talk all day, every day. So, ladies and gentlemen, once again, Thom Hartmann, and of course, there's the Thom Hartmann Show, right? Is that the correct name for the radio show? There's this book plus many others, so you can buy multiple books. But I do want to thank you again, Thom Hartmann, for being on the Phil Ferguson Show.
Phil, thank you very much. And people can learn more about it at hartmannreport.com or at thom.tv.